Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about the East India Company. We are so excited to welcome back to the podcast our first returning guest, Sharmini Kumar. Sharmini is the founder and artistic director of 24 Carat Productions, a production company based in Melbourne, Australia, which, among many other projects, hosts the annual AustenCon. She has written, directed, and produced many performance pieces, short films, and radio documentaries. Sharmini loves Austen's humor and wit, and particularly likes to explore issues that are not often highlighted in adaptations of Austen's work. She has presented on the East India Company at both AustenCon and the 2022 virtual JaneCon. Her side gig, as she likes to say, is working as a medical doctor. Welcome, Sharmini.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for having me twice. I hadn't thought about it, but yes, I'm a first return guest. That's so exciting.
We are delighted.
Absolutely.
Yes, we're very excited to have you back for AustenCon as well.
Well, thank you. So we are basing our conversation today in Sense and Sensibility and on Colonel Brandon's military career. We learn early on that Colonel Brandon was based in the East Indies, but he makes overt references to his career when he shares with Eleanor a little bit of his personal history with his first love, Eliza, who married his brother. So here's a quote from the book. He says, "But can we wonder that with such a husband to provoke inconstancy, and without a friend to advise or restrain her, for my father lived only a few months after their marriage, and I was with my regiment in the East Indies, she should fall. Had I remained in England, perhaps, but I meant to promote the happiness of both by removing from her for years, and for that purpose have procured my exchange." Kind of some deep history there.
Yeah.
The family history is. It's a lot.
heavy. Yeah.
And he was the second son, so he wasn't going to, inherit the big, until obviously his brother passed away. He wasn't going to inherit, so he had to do something, and obviously he didn't want to be a clergyman, so soldier it was.
Yeah. Yep. Packed up, wanted to be away from this situation at home.
So, Sharmini, throughout the novel, we only get these very small glimpses into Colonel Brandon's military career, which are really just these passing references to the East Indies. Can you tell us a bit more about where Brandon was likely serving and what the British military was doing there?
So they do specifically reference not just the East Indies, but India when they talk about nabobs. So we know he was somewhere in India. Also, the majority of the British presence in that region was in India. They'd basically given up what they called the East Indies, which is more what we would call Indonesia now, to the Dutch for the spice trade. And at that time, which is the late 18th century we're looking at, the British were heavily into India, which the whole region, what they called India, is probably now what we would call India, Pakistan, even as far as like Bangladesh. They tried for Afghanistan but never managed it. Yeah, so that's that whole region. And the British had no specific, the British Crown really wasn't doing anything there. They would occasionally meet the French there for wars. The English and French managed to have wars between the English and French, like everywhere.
Right.
That's, I think, what you call the Franco-Indian War in the US. It was a 7 Years' War that the British call it. So they just kind of took their skirmishes abroad. And India was one of those places. But the majority of what was happening there at the time was commercial interest by a private company, and that's the British East India Company. And the company had its own soldiers. The company had commanders and even soldiers of the Crown that basically served with the company as it's a kind of weird thing that we think of basically trained military people being for hire as mercenaries to a corporation, which is not completely unknown even in our time. But we kind of think of it as a not a great thing, but that was just normal for them. And so whatever the sort of arrangement was, it's almost certain that Brandon was in India militarily protecting the trade of the British East India Company. Yeah, it's not really a gallant kind of defending the honour of Britain or sort of, he's there purely to protect trade, really.
Right. And trade in an empirical situation.
Oh, trade as an empire, and particularly in that second half of the 18th century, the British East India Company had made it really clear that they were not there to meet with Indian traders on their own terms. They were like, we're here to basically take you over and we're having everything on our terms. It started with the Battle of Plassey in 1757, where the infamous gentleman Clive of India defeated a bunch of Indian troops and was just basically like, all right, now you owe me taxes. Yeah, pay up and you do what I say kind of thing.
Well, and because you kind of mentioned already that there is this very deep relationship between the East India Company and like the military, because he is a colonel. Colonel Brandon is there in India, most likely helping with the East India Company. And so what role that would actually be?
Yeah, like how are the British Army and the East India Company sort of linked up during this time?
So in India, it's the East India Company that run everything, yeah, with the occasional battle with the French or whatever. But even then, the troops were basically working together, and it was one thing. But as far as the majority of day-to-day stuff goes, the company are in charge, and they had some English officers that they would work with. So obviously, like Colonel Brandon. They had a lot of Indian, again, mercenaries, people for, soldiers for hire, that were called sepoys. And they were tasked with like the constant defense of and protection of the East India Company's trade. They're kind of to protect them against any Indian rulers who might want to take back some of their territory, to enforce the kind of taxation and other things like that were being imposed on the people by the company. That was their job.
So it's both offensive and defensive. It's kind of, going on the offense to say, we want this resource, we're going to help the East India Company attain that resource. But then also defensive in terms of, we're going to make sure that this resource gets out of India to England, and we're going to defend that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's all of those things. It was a massive army, yeah. The majority of those people were, like, particularly, the lower ranks were Indian people, but it was really, really large numbers.
So was the East India Company, were they contracting with the British Army, or was the British government just sending soldiers over because they wanted the East India Company to be successful?
It's an incredibly blurry line because at this point in time, so many people in the British Parliament have shares in the British East India Company. Mm-hmm. So they're not gonna vote for anything that's gonna, they're just like, anything you want, you're gonna get it. Like when these regiments got there, they were basically, the person they were answering to was a company person.
Right. This was definitely company command.
Company command, yeah. And some of the big battles, again, this is slightly before Brandon's time, but Robert Clive was not even a military person. But perhaps for your American listeners haven't heard of Robert Clive. Robert Clive, a British man who decided to work with the company in a kind of administrative role, got there. He'd been a bully as a kid, a really kind of nasty character, got there, didn't love the admin side of it, but then saw these opportunities to expand the holdings of the company, basically took his soldiers, won a couple of very significant battles, Battle of Plassey, as I mentioned, in 1757, and then just basically became like the richest person in the whole of Europe in terms of monetary wealth, bought castles, bought influence in Parliament. That was a thing that was happening in the UK. People would make so much money in the British East India Company and take Indian wealth back to England, and with that money would buy a seat in Parliament, basically. And it was a big concern at the time. So when Willoughby kind of talks about nabobs a little bit sort of disparagingly, is sort of talking about those sorts of people that would flash all this new wealth around would be a little bit concerning because people are like, oh, I don't know how we feel about these people having influence in Parliament, forgetting, of course, that, the House of Lords is literally just a very rich landholder.
Right.
So it's part of the democratic process. So this is what's happening. So people who weren't even military people were running these battles, were in charge of these troops, were kind of setting up these offensives to take over and to maintain that control.
Well, and if you make enough money that you can then buy a seat in Parliament to then pass the kind of laws that are going to be really favorable to your business interests, and then you can just keep perpetuating.
Absolutely. Yes. And as I said, it's partly those people buying that influence, but also so many people in Parliament had shares in the British East India Company. It was a corporation too big to fail.
Right.
And like the number of people in positions of power who are profiting off of this colonialism.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And what you've been describing is reframing Brandon's career a little bit for me, because obviously he's over there in a position of power for the British East India Company, and then he inherits Delaford.
Yes. It's a clever kind of move on Jane Austen's part to then have him inherit, because the money then isn't, his estate isn't seen then as like tainted by that kind of either the colonialism aspect or the nouveau riche aspect of it either. He still comes and inherits old money, so he's still respectable in that society.
Right.
But I mean, there's a lot of speculation about Jane Austen's connection to the British East India Company. Her family had connections with Warren Hastings, who was the governor of the East India Company, and who was the sort of person who, unlike sort of Robert Clive, who came in and was just like, let's just pillage, let's just take what we can. I actually hate India, but I'm taking it all with me. Was a bit more of a like, oh, this place is kind of nice. These people have a really interesting culture. But he had been quite heavily criticised for his behaviour and the behaviour of the East India Company, and was impeached by Parliament. And there's sort of speculation about whether Brandon is sort of based on this character who spent some time there, but who was a bit more of a gentle colonizer, if you want to put it that way. And we can kind of understand Marianne's response to Brandon as well, in perhaps a slightly different way too, that if she knows this about him, she's a little bit dismissive of the way if there were mosquitoes there, obviously. But also, I feel like Marianne's the sort of person who probably wouldn't necessarily be a big fan of military things, and probably not necessarily, she'd probably be a big fan of like Indian things, like Indian textiles, because the British East India Company's point was the majority of what they were doing was in the textile trade.
Right.
It's the muslin, right?
Muslin was the specialty fabric that was product of India. So she would love all of that sort of stuff. But, reports trickling through the newspapers about the treatment of Indian workers in warehouses and things like that. I'm not guessing Marianne wouldn't be a fan. But she would also be quite happy, particularly in the early stages of the book, to have another reason to dislike Colonel Brandon.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think that's true.
Yeah, so there's that level of Brandon that I hadn't really thought about much before reading about the British East India Company, where he's Alan Rickman, so we love him. But
right.
he's also so incredibly tied up with this colonial project.
Right.
It's impossible to overemphasize the impact that the East India Company had on England, on the government of the time, just the way that we understand this entire era. But what are some of the ways that you see the East India Company having the biggest impact on Austen's world?
There's so many things. I mean, like I said, textiles were their kind of stock in trade and what they made so much of their money off, particularly initially. Those beautiful cotton gowns, which, you can't think of an Austen adaptation without them, those beautiful lightweight fabrics that were woven by hand. And so initially the British project was to take over that and just capture that market literally by, buying those whole bolts of cloth and using them, but then eventually shut down that market by industrialization and sort of, as we're getting into the 19th century, shifting that to machine produce, to the point where there's projects on today to try and reclaim some of those weaving techniques that were basically, hand weaving techniques that are incredibly intricate
Like artisanal, like you really have to have the skill.
Artisanal, and we're completely lost. The trade was lost, partly because of the British East India Company, and people are now trying to recreate what was being done at that time. So in those textiles and even the headwear, you think of some of those adaptations where people were wearing kind of turban-style, women more than men wearing turban-style headgear. So I see it, a lot of that influence in the dress of the time.
So just the look. When we think Regency look.
Yeah, absolutely. The Regency look is really, really tied to India. This is sort of moving away from Sense and Sensibility, but Henry Tilney prides himself on his knowledge of muslins.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he does.
And yeah, so I've wondered, where General Tilney was, where he generaled.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's been, fanfic that I've read that's been like, oh yeah, it must have been the East India Company because of, Henry growing up to know about muslins. I mean, even tea, like such a quintessential British thing. And, you think about Regency, the classic lady in the Empire line gown drinking tea. And tea is, is a British East India Company thing. The tea that was dumped into Boston Harbour was British East India Company.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and the whole sort of process of acquiring the tea was, buying it from the Chinese and then smuggling opium into China in order to acquire funds for tea, and that tea doesn't grow in Britain.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So I see it really in lots of those little things. Also, I always wonder now with those houses like Norland Park, where does all that money come from? Large percentages of people who had investments in the British East India Company, as well as obviously, slave plantations and other things at Mansfield Park. But so much of the wealth of this country is coming from India. It's there in the background, but it's there when I see adaptations. It's there when I read the novels. It's just in the back of my mind.
Yeah, that inescapability of India's impact on the way that England fundamentally functions.
That's right. It's the soup that they're swimming in Britain at this point in time, in England. So at this point in time, definitely can't pretend that Austen isn't aware of it. Yeah, she knew. So yeah, her cousin was Warren Hastings' goddaughter.
Possibly actual daughter. We're not sure on that.
Possibly actual daughter.
Scandal.
But yes, possible natural daughter. The family during the impeachment of Warren Hastings in the 1790s were very pro Hastings. They would read the newspapers and would be like, hope he gets out of this one okay.
Well, and Sharmini, you had mentioned kind of in passing earlier that there is a passage in Sense and Sensibility where both Marianne and Willoughby are being pretty dismissive about Brandon and the references to India particularly. Can you tell us a bit more about why you think Austen maybe embedded that specific scene or references into this text?
Obviously, I can only speculate. I just wonder if she's kind of hinting at the kind of ways that people who don't have a lot of experience with India just think of India. And in one sense, like we were just talking about, that Marianne has an appreciation for pretty things, but doesn't necessarily even connect that to India. Like, there's a way in which she could have said, oh, India, I have a gown that's Indian muslin, And obviously she kind of wouldn't do that because she's wanting to connect India to Brandon to unpleasant things. But to be that sort of dismissive about India and about people who have been to India, not dismissive even in a way that's like, oh, they were doing a bad thing, but just like, it's like not a grand thing to be doing. It's not that exciting a thing to be doing. It's just such a common thing that, just like Marianne going like, no big deal, because so many people did. I do think she's kind of reflecting a bit of a mood of like, you try and talk yourself up. Not that Brandon is trying to talk himself up, but people try to talk him up for this thing, and everybody does it really.
There's a lack of glamour attached to this for her.
There's a lack of glamour attached to it, particularly from that upper class perspective of like, we are the landed gentry.
Well, it's interesting that this whole scene with her and Willoughby, it's not rooted in sort of, like you said, condemnation for these sort of imperialist actions, for like horrible things that are being done in this country. It's really this kind of rooted in like a snobbery of, it's not that big of a deal anyway. And even if you made a lot of money, like that's new money.
That's right. That's right. But I mean, I do like to think that Marianne was kind of a little bit aware and probably had that side of it as well. But, you know, the stuff that the British East India Company were doing, in addition to like taxing the heck out of people and just basically decimating the cotton weaving industry for their own purposes. The country went through famines when food production was scarce and continued to tax the whole way through that. You know, sent soldiers around to collect taxes from starving people during a famine so that shareholders could continue to make money. That is what they were doing. But Marianne's like, do you know what? I'm not so stressed about that. But, you know, just don't think of yourself as a big deal.
Well, and in that same scene, she's also trying to impress Willoughby, and Willoughby is the one who's like full on disdain of Brandon.
That's right. Yeah.
And so there's a certain amount of Marianne trying to imitate the behavior that she thinks Willoughby will find most appealing.
Yes.
And Willoughby's the one who's just like, he's pretty mean, actually.
Well, he's really trying to put down Brandon.
And so it's kind of like, it's very revealing what Willoughby's game is.
Yes. So particularly the use of the word nabob is really indicated that new money from India was what a very specific type of money. And I mean, you know, Willoughby's a fine one to talk. He's dependent on an inheritance. Like,
yeah, he's got zero ethical high ground. No,
yeah, that's right. That's right. And you're right. I think Marianne is taking her cue about that. I don't think she's being dishonest in terms of her own feelings, but yeah, I do wonder. I do like to think that in slightly different company, she does have a bit more kind of ethical concern for things that happen. Maybe I'm reading a bit too much into Marianne.
You know, setting aside Marianne, it's not as if Willoughby is sort of like giving a speech about the atrocities committed in, the gain for financial gain. You know, it's not about that at all. It's really just about putting Brandon down. So absolutely, yeah. And
I guess in terms of their relationship, I feel like Willoughby is definitely not somebody who even thinks about colonialism or atrocities or any of that kind of stuff. And I do feel like Marianne does have the capacity to think through those things and probably does in some other reflective, non-Willoughby centered moments have that kind of reflection.
It's the sort of thing where like the East India Company was not doing good things, but that is not where Willoughby's criticism was coming from at all. Yeah, I don't think that he would probably actually have any ethical qualms about it whatsoever.
No, I don't think Willoughby would. No, I agree.
His dismissiveness also, because it's not rooted in those things, is also a pretty damning character indictment.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, where he's kind of oblivious to the fact that India is relevant for so many reasons, but then the fact that he's also not culturally conscious enough to even care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, none of that conversation really engages with Indian people, or India as anything other than a place for British people to go to and take stuff.
It's so true.
And it's something that I've tried to sort of look at in the stuff that I produce as well. So our adaptation of Sense and Sensibility that we produced earlier this year, we really tried to dig into what that means that Brandon was a, agent of the British East India Company, and what it means for Marianne to kind of have to deal with that. We set ours slightly later than the probable setting of the book, so that, to talk about all kinds of things with the British East India Company and sugar and all the different trades that they were involved in. And for podcast listeners, there is a podcast called Empire that is by the British historians, William Dalrymple and Anita Anand, who literally wrote the book on the British East India Company. The book is by William Dalrymple. It's called The Anarchy. It's a very good book. And Anita Anand is a British Indian historian who's written a lot about a slightly later period. And together, they're a fabulous team. I highly recommend the podcast.
Yeah, thanks.
It's called Empire. They deal with lots of things outside the Regency era, but there's some good background about the British East India Company.
Love that resource. Thank you.
Well, Sharmini, where can our listeners find you online, learn more about you, and find out more about 24 Karat Productions, AustinCon, where they can buy tickets to AustinCon?
Okay, so the easiest spot is at 24caratproductions.com. 24 the number, carrot the vegetable, productions.com. And that'll have links in it to AustinCon and upcoming productions. We're having a very Austin-heavy couple of years with 24 Carat. We do other things, but having done Sense and Sensibility, we've got Persuasion coming up and Mansfield Park as well. So, and again, Mansfield Park is one that I've taken it and gone, all right, well, what if Fanny Price's sailor dad was actually one of the Indian sailors that had come back on the boats and was stuck basically in England because they wouldn't give him a job on a ship going back the other way. What if that was one of the extra reasons that the family were a little bit about Fanny? So we've got a biracial Fanny Price written into that script. And so hopefully going to be a really interesting look at that, not specifically British East India Company, but the experience of being biracial in Regency England. Yeah, so we'll be streaming all of that stuff as well, so people all over the world. Yeah, so AustinCon is streamed. All our stuff we try to video and stream because we want to share it with as many people as possible. So yeah.
Awesome.
And AustinCon is coming right around the corner.
AustinCon is coming right up. It is on November the 5th in Australian time.
Important distinction.
It's an important distinction. So that is a Friday night, I believe, for Americans. Which is, fun way to spend a Friday night, but also because a lot of our streaming stuff will make videos available for a couple of weeks afterwards. Perfect. So you'll be able to catch up on it. And if you're not able to participate in live stuff online, we've got lots of stuff. We've got the two of you. Tell us what you'll be talking about.
We will be talking about circulating libraries. So very
excited about that. Yeah, we've got lots of different speakers, lots of different activities that you'll be able to participate in online as well as if you want to turn up in person.
Well, thank you again, Sharmini. It is a delight to have you on again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you again to Sharmini Kumar for joining us for this discussion. You can find us on Instagram at The Thing About Austin and on Twitter at Austin_things. You can also check out our website, thethingaboutaustin.com, and email us at thethingaboutaustin@gmail.com.
And stay tuned for next episode, where we will be talking about John Thorpe's reference to the monk.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.